Hi, and welcome to this free video tutorial series from Pro Tools Expert, looking at the Dolby Atmos home entertainment workflow. I'm Alan Salabank from Pro Tools Expert, and in this series I'll be sharing with you tips and tricks to help you get to grips with the audio post-production workflows for content to be delivered in Dolby Atmos home entertainment. Mixing in Dolby Atmos can unlock a whole world of creative possibilities and really bring any piece to life with immersive audio. However, in order to ensure that all your creative efforts aren't thwarted at the final hurdle, delivery, it is vitally important to plan ahead. Dolby have really thought this through, and there are lots of tools within the Dolby Atmos production suite which can help you plan ahead. So let's start from scratch from the beginning and look at the setting up of your system. First, you need to fire up the Dolby Atmos renderer. Once this is running, you can then go to the Preferences and select the audio driver for the renderer. If you're using the Dolby Audio Bridge in Pro Tools, then you need to select the Core Audio option under the driver as your input device. And then select your hardware interface as your output device. In my case, it's a Focusrite Thunderbolt interface. You only need to worry about the external sync source if you're looking at being able to master out Dolby Atmos, or you need to take advantage of the built-in loudness measurement. My recommendation is to use the LTC over audio and bring it in over the highest channel possible of the Dolby Audio Bridge. Then select your frame rate, in my case 25 frames per second, and your sample rate, in my case 48 kHz. You can then set up other aspects of the renderer. Have the spatial coding emulation switched on, and I generally have the output limiting switched on as well. This is just a protection for your monitoring. For this part of the setup, we need the speaker processing to be switched on. I generally have the bass management switched off, but you can change that as per your preferences and your monitoring setup. We will leave the headphone processing off for the moment, and we will turn off the re-render processing. Loudness we will leave switched on because it's always handy to be able to check these things. And here's an important piece of information for you. This is the IP address of this renderer's software. This will come in handy for our next stage. Once you're happy with all your settings, click Accept. Now we can go to Pro Tools and go to Setup Peripherals. Go to the Atmos tab. This is to ensure that Pro Tools is communicating properly with the Dolby Atmos renderer in terms of getting the metadata behind all the Atmos objects from Pro Tools to the renderer properly. So you need to go and enable this link and your object and audio recording. Check that the IP host displayed actually tallies with the renderer that you're running, and check that the connection status is a solid green. If you see this flashing green, then that means that the connection is not working properly. The next step is to check your room setup. This is under the Dolby Atmos Renderer's window menu. Then go to Room Setup. This defines your loudspeaker layout. In my case, I have 7.1.4 monitoring. You may not have quite as much monitoring capability, but that's not a problem because you can define this easily within this menu. You can change this monitor layout to reflect the monitor setup you have, and you can add other monitoring layouts as per your preference. Then you need to route the audio to your speakers. It's a simple case of just defining which physical outputs feed your speakers. The headphones output defaults to channels 63 and 64. For reasons that we'll address in a subsequent episode of these tutorials, I generally change this to be 13 and 14. This then gives me the maximum available re-render channels. Due to my specific hardware configuration, I've changed the re-render channels to start from channel 17. Again, click Accept once you're happy with all your settings. You can also go into the speaker calibration section of the Dolby Atmos renderer to check that your routing is correct. You just need to turn on the signal generator, and then you can click on the various speakers to check that the sound is coming from the right places. Now we can go to Pro Tools and start defining our output setup. Of course, it is also important to double check that your playback engine is set to the Dolby audio bridge, and depending on the power of your host system, you may want to have dynamic plug-in processing ticked or not. As I have a reasonably powerful system, I generally tend to untick the dynamic plug-in processing, as I have found that there are less issues with variable latency on plugins with this option set this way. Once you've checked your playback engine, we can now set up the Pro Tools I/O. As you can see here, I have made this I/O setup blank, and you can see that the Dolby Audio Bridge gives you 130 outputs from native Pro Tools. It's important to note that the Dolby channel order is different to that of Pro Tools' own internal channel order. Pro Tools uses what is known as the film layout, which is left, center, right, then the various surrounds, followed by the LFE, then the height channels last. However, the Dolby renderer uses a different layout known as SMPTE, so you need to go to 7.1.2 to select the SMPTE layout. Then you can create your bed outputs. As you can see, these are being laid out in the correct channel order for Dolby Atmos. And you can see on the bus tab that these have been mapped correctly automatically. There is no need to map these to an object because these are beds. We can now switch to the Dolby Atmos renderer and set up its inputs accordingly. Go to the rendering menu and input configuration. By default, it comes set up with the first 10 channels as a bed and the remaining 118 channels as objects. While this does give you a lot of flexibility with the objects, I find that it does limit you when you have to make deliverables. I would select all and just reset the inputs to give you a clean slate. Then we can set up which groups are assigned to the various inputs. I have set up 3 groups: dialogue, music, and effects. This means that when you assign your inputs to your beds or your objects, these categories or groups will be available to allocate your objects or beds to. I'm going to set up 3 7.1.2 beds. There's my first with the dialogue category, my second with the music category, and here's my third with the effects category. Once you click accept, the inputs display will then update to show what you've done. These purple highlighted inputs are the bed inputs. Now we can go back to Pro Tools and start setting up our objects. It's important to plan ahead and think about how many objects you're actually going to need for the task in hand. If you're doing a relatively simple piece with not an awful lot of creative immersive audio panning, then you don't have to use as many objects as if you were doing, say, a big science fiction piece. I would generally add objects a set amount at a time. So as well as the dialogue bed, I would normally have about 8 mono objects to allow for creative placement of dialogue. These have all come up as mono. This can be an issue when it comes to dealing with stereo sound sources, so there is a workaround. I'm going to add 2 stereo object outputs here, which I'm going to use as static objects for the height channels of a reverb return. When we go to the bus tabs, you can see that we still need to map these object sends to object inputs back over in the Dolby Atmos renderer. We can now go to the input configuration window again. The 3 beds use the first 30 inputs of the Dolby Atmos renderer. Back in Pro Tools, you can see that the mapping to object option is now available. However, it isn't for the stereo outputs you've set up. The easiest way to get around this is simply to open the subpaths for the stereo objects, and then you get the mapping to object option available. You can then select all your objects that you have assigned so far. Bearing in mind that the beds have taken up the first 30 inputs of the Dolby Atmos renderer, you can select a range and route them accordingly. Now we can go to the Dolby Atmos renderer input configuration window again. Select the range that you are routed to, hold down Shift, and set them as objects, and then as these are dialogue objects, set them as the dialogue group. Once you hit accept, you will see that the halo displays have come up on the input configuration display. They are currently grey as you don't have any Pro Tools paths routed to them yet. Going back to the Pro Tools output tab again, I'm going to add another 8 mono music objects and another 4 stereo music objects to act as height returns for upmixers and reverbs. You can then go back to the bus tab and assign these accordingly to the objects. Again, we go to the input configuration window on the Dolby Atmos renderer and set these accordingly. We can see on the Pro Tools I/O setting menu that the music objects are routed to inputs 43 through 58. So I can select that range here. Set them all as objects and select them as the music category. You can see that the halo displays on these object inputs have come up grey and been filled in. Because effects are often more complicated, I'm going to set up 16 mono objects for the effects and 16 stereo objects. You can see now that this is starting to fill up our I/O. You can get more complicated and break down the categories as much as you like, but just remember to reflect how you've broken down your categories in the Dolby Atmos renderer, as well as in the Pro Tools I/O setup. As you can see, we now have a variety of object paths which are mapped correctly to object inputs, and we have no overlapping objects either. Once you've got your I/O set up the way you want it, I always find that it's a good idea to export your settings and save them. This means that should your I/O setup get accidentally overwritten by another session, then it's very simple to get your I/O setup back. Now we can go ahead and set up a session that can use these objects. Let's set up some tracks to feed this session. I'm going to route the first 4 of these dialogue tracks to the dialogue bed output. It is possible to route channels to both an object and to a bed simultaneously. And because we've set up the stereo object paths, when we have a stereo source channel, it does not become an issue to route these accordingly. You can even route different channels to the same object, but be aware that the pan metadata for each will be linked. Switching between a track routed to a bed and to an object is automatable. If you switch your automation to latch mode, you'll be able to see that if you select an audio path to be routed to an object, it will write as a piece of automation. If we now go to the Dolby Atmos renderer, you can see that the objects that are routed to have come up with the blue halo on their inputs. Once you send a signal to them, you'll see that input light up green, and in fact those inputs will change colour depending on the level being sent. You will also notice that the physical location of these objects within the immersive 3D space is shown both on the Pro Tools panners and on the Dolby Atmos renderer display. You can see them moving and changing in 3 dimensions. This is because Pro Tools is communicating the metadata for the immersive placement of these objects to the Dolby Atmos renderer. Note that if you're using a stereo sound source with a stereo panner, then the Dolby Atmos renderer display only shows the side of the control that you are actively moving at the time. So that's all from this first episode of the Pro Tools Expert tutorial series on Dolby Atmos home entertainment workflow. Come back for the next episode where we'll be taking a closer look at how Avid and Dolby recommend that we set up and execute our Dolby home entertainment Atmos sessions. See you next time.